It was a quiet morning in the royal city. The sun shone brightly over the grand palace, casting long shadows over the cobblestone streets. People moved through the city in a steady flow, going about their day, shopkeepers selling their wares, children laughing and playing, and travelers making their way to distant places. The air smelled of freshly baked bread, and the chatter of the crowd filled the atmosphere. The royal guards stood at their posts, tall and strong, their eyes scanning the crowd. Clad in shining armor, they were a symbol of protection and order, always ready to defend the palace and its citizens. The guards weren't known for showing emotion. Their job was to remain alert, watching over the city with quiet discipline. They stood like statues, silent and still, yet always aware of everything happening around them. Among the crowd was a man, an older man with a weathered face and a steady walk. His name was Samuel, a veteran of many battles from years past. Though his once strong frame had softened with age, there was a quiet strength in his every step. He wore simple clothes now, nothing that drew attention, preferring the peace and quiet of his small home to the noise of the world. Samuel had seen many things in his life, things that would make most men shudder. But that was behind him now. He had served his time in the military, fought on distant battlefields, and come home with stories that few could relate to. Now he walked the streets of the city not as a soldier, but as an ordinary man trying to find peace. He had passed by the royal guards many times, always nodding politely as he walked past. They had seen him around, and some even recognized him from his younger days when he wore the uniform of a soldier. But today, as he walked toward the palace gates, something felt different. A young man, standing at the corner of the street, caught his eye. He was leaning against a lamp-post, his arms crossed and a cocky grin on his face. Samuel could tell by the way the man stood that he wasn't just some passerby. There was something about him, a sense of arrogance, as if he owned the place. Samuel continued walking, his eyes shifting away from the young man. He had no interest in trouble, but as he walked past, the young man suddenly called out to him. "Hey, old man, you looking for a fight?" The thug shouted, his voice loud and sharp, drawing attention from nearby pedestrians. Samuel didn't stop. He knew how to deal with young men like him, ignore them, walk away, and let them get bored. But the thug wasn't done yet. "Come on, what's the matter? Too old to fight back?" The young man jeered, stepping forward. Samuel felt his heart rate rise slightly, but he kept walking. He wasn't looking for a fight today. However, the young man wasn't going to let it go that easily. As Samuel took another step, the young man shoved him hard in the back. The shove wasn't enough to knock Samuel down, but it was enough to make him stumble. He grunted, his feet momentarily losing their balance. The royal guards, standing nearby, saw everything. But they did nothing. The crowd around them watched in silence, unsure of what to do. They had seen arguments before, but this was different. Samuel, the quiet veteran, was the target this time. And for the first time in a long time, the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. The street was filled with the noise of the city, but for Samuel, everything seemed to slow down in that moment. He could feel the eyes of the people on him, watching the exchange with the young man. The shove had caught him off guard, but Samuel wasn't a man who easily lost his composure. His heart beat a little faster, but he kept his focus on the task at hand, getting away from this young troublemaker. The young man, however, was not letting him go that easily. He stepped closer, a smug smile on his face, clearly enjoying the reaction he had caused. Samuel continued to walk, hoping that if he ignored him, the situation would die down. But the young man wasn't done yet. "You're not gonna just walk away, are you? Old man, do you think you can just ignore me?" the young man said, his voice now full of mockery. Samuel could feel the tension in the air. He was too experienced to let his temper take over, but even he could sense that this wasn't going to end quietly. He had seen similar situations in his past, and they rarely ended without some sort of conflict. Samuel slowed his pace and turned to face the young man, who was still grinning, clearly expecting Samuel to react with anger or fear. Instead, Samuel stood tall and locked eyes with the thug. He didn't say anything at first, just stared, his expression calm and steady. This was the veteran in him, the man who had faced much more dangerous situations in his life and had learned that sometimes silence spoke louder than words. The young man's smile faltered for a moment. He wasn't used to people not reacting to his taunts. He stepped closer again, his words getting more heated. "You're not scared of me, are you? I could take you down with a snap of my fingers." Samuel didn't flinch. Instead, he took a slow breath and then spoke, his voice steady but firm. "It's not about fear, boy. It's about respect." The words seemed to surprise the young man. For a moment, he seemed unsure of how to respond. The crowd, which had been watching with nervous curiosity, fell silent. They had seen the thug's bravado, but now there was a sense of anticipation in the air. Would the older man back down, or was he about to show the young troublemaker something he didn't expect? Just then, Samuel noticed something. The royal guards, standing a few feet away, had shifted slightly. Their attention was now fully on the situation, though they remained silent. Samuel knew that they would not intervene unless things escalated beyond control. But at that moment, they were waiting to see how this veteran would handle the situation. The young man, seeing that his words had not had the desired effect, took another step closer, his posture now more aggressive. He clearly thought that the older man was bluffing. Samuel's hand subtly brushed the small pouch he kept at his side, a reminder of his time in the military. It wasn't a weapon, but a tool he had used often during his service. "Listen," the young man said, trying a different approach. "I'm just trying to have some fun. Don't take it personally." Samuel raised an eyebrow, his gaze never leaving the young man. "Fun? Is that what you call this? Making trouble for no reason?" The young man's grin returned, but this time it wasn't as confident. Samuel's calmness was starting to unsettle him, and the crowd could feel it. Everyone was now wondering what would happen next. The young man's grin started to fade as Samuel stood there, unmoving, his eyes locked on him. The crowd around them was still, watching with wide eyes. Some of the onlookers murmured quietly to each other, unsure of what to expect. The royal guards, standing close by, remained silent, their faces unreadable. It was clear that everyone was waiting for something to happen. The young man shifted on his feet, clearly frustrated that his usual tricks weren't working. He had expected the veteran to react with anger or fear, but instead, Samuel's calm demeanor seemed to unsettle him. He hadn't planned for this kind of response, and it made him feel uneasy. Samuel, on the other hand, was well aware of the situation. He had been in much more dangerous spots before, far from the safety of the royal palace. The years of military service had taught him how to keep his cool, how to not let emotions rule his actions. He wasn't about to let some young man with an attitude change that. The young man took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. "Come on, old man," he said, trying to sound casual, but there was a hint of nervousness in his voice. "I was just playing around. You're making this too serious." Samuel didn't respond at first, letting the words hang in the air. Then, after a long moment, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "It's never about being serious. It's about respect. You may not understand that, but that's the way it is." The young man scowled, clearly not used to being talked to like this. "Respect? From you? What do you know about respect?" He spat, stepping closer to Samuel. The crowd tensed, and Samuel felt the shift in the air. The young man's posture was becoming more aggressive, and the tension between them was growing by the second. For a moment, Samuel thought about walking away, but something in the young man's attitude made him stop. He wasn't afraid of a physical confrontation, but there was something more important at play here. This wasn't just about a fight. It was about showing this young man the consequences of his actions. Before the young man could say anything else, Samuel took a step forward, his movements slow but confident. He didn't need to shout or make a scene. His calmness, his presence, spoke volumes. The thug hesitated, unsure of what to do next. The crowd watched, completely silent now, waiting for the next move. Just as the situation seemed on the edge of boiling over, Samuel spoke again, his voice calm but carrying a sense of finality. "You don't have to like me, but you will respect me. That's how it works." The royal guards, who had been watching closely, exchanged a quick glance. They knew better than to intervene in a situation like this, unless it went beyond words. But something about the veteran's calmness had made them pause. They could see that Samuel wasn't just standing his ground. He was teaching a lesson. The young man, now standing face to face with the veteran, seemed to realize that the situation wasn't as easy as he had thought. The arrogance that had been so obvious earlier was beginning to fade. He wasn't used to being challenged this way, especially not by someone much older than him. A brief moment of silence passed. The young man took a step back, his hands trembling slightly. The crowd remained still, unsure of what would happen next. Samuel stood tall, his eyes never leaving the young man in front of him. He could see the uncertainty in the thug's eyes now. The cocky attitude that had been so obvious just moments ago was fading, replaced by hesitation. Samuel knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about teaching a lesson, about showing the young man that there were more important things than pride and arrogance. But as he stood there, something stirred deep inside him. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. The feeling of standing on the battlefield, ready for whatever came next. He remembered the days when his senses were always sharp, his mind always alert, ready to face danger at any moment. Those memories were part of him now, ingrained in his soul. It was why he could stay so calm in moments like this, why he could look at the young man without fear, despite the tension in the air. The memories came rushing back, and Samuel found himself remembering the war. It felt like a lifetime ago, but the images were still clear in his mind. The sound of explosions, the feeling of adrenaline coursing through his veins as he fought for survival. He had been young then, full of energy and determination, just like the thug in front of him. But war had a way of changing people. It made you realize what really mattered and what didn't. It taught you to pick your battles, to recognize when to fight and when to walk away. Samuel's hand brushed against the side of his pants, where he kept a small pouch. A simple tool, but one that had seen him through many tough situations. It wasn't a weapon, but it reminded him of who he used to be, of the soldier he once was. The pouch wasn't just a piece of equipment. It was a symbol of everything he had gone through, everything he had learned. He remembered his comrades, the men and women who had fought by his side. They had been more than just fellow soldiers. They had been a family. They had shared everything together, from the hardest battles to the moments of quiet, when all they had was each other. He remembered the feeling of knowing that someone had his back, just as he had theirs. That sense of camaraderie had kept him going, even when things seemed impossible. But there was another memory that stood out, the memory of loss. Samuel had seen his friends fall in battle. He had watched them give everything for the cause, and he had felt the weight of their sacrifices on his shoulders. That weight had never truly gone away, and even now, it was with him. It was a reminder that not everything in life could be fixed with strength or anger. Sometimes, it took something deeper. The young man in front of him didn't know any of that. He didn't understand the sacrifices that Samuel had made, the things he had seen. But maybe, just maybe, this moment would be enough to make him think. Samuel straightened up, his past no longer a distant memory but a part of his present. He turned his attention back to the young man, who was still watching him, unsure of what to do next. The air was thick with tension, but Samuel wasn't going to let it consume him. He had learned too much to let this moment slip by. The young man opened his mouth to say something, but Samuel cut him off. "You don't have to be like this. You can choose a better path." The words were simple, but they held weight. Samuel knew that the young man might not understand them now, but he hoped they would stick with him. And for Samuel, that was enough. The young man stood there, still unsure of how to react. His chest heaved with anger, but the fire in his eyes had started to dim. Samuel's calmness was something he hadn't expected. He had been hoping for a fight, for some sign of weakness in the older man, but all he saw was strength and silence, something he couldn't quite understand. The crowd, sensing that something important was happening, grew even quieter. The royal guards, who had been standing still like statues, began to shift ever so slightly. They too were watching, waiting to see how this situation would unfold. It wasn't every day that someone stood up to a troublemaker like the young man, and it certainly wasn't every day that someone did so with such grace. The thug, now visibly frustrated, clenched his fists. His voice shook slightly as he spoke. "You think you can just teach me a lesson? You're nothing but an old man who's past his prime." He took a step forward, as if to prove his point, but something in Samuel's eyes made him hesitate. Samuel stood motionless, his posture as firm as it had been all along. He didn't feel the need to argue or defend himself. The situation had already spoken for itself. Instead, he simply stared at the young man, his expression unchanged. Then, in the calmest voice imaginable, Samuel finally spoke. "You're right. I'm old, and I'm not as fast as I used to be." He paused for a moment, watching the young man's expression change, unsure of what was coming next. "But what I have now is something you don't. I've learned patience. I've learned that not every fight is worth fighting. Sometimes, it's better to stand tall and let the storm pass." The words hit the thug harder than any punch could have. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He had expected a fight, maybe a yelling match, but instead, the veteran was offering him wisdom, something that, in his anger, he hadn't been prepared to hear. Samuel continued, his voice steady. "You may think that by pushing me, you're proving something, but all you're doing is showing me that you haven't learned anything. Strength isn't just about how hard you can push. It's also about knowing when to step back, when to show restraint. That's the kind of strength that matters." The young man's confidence began to falter. His fists were still clenched, but the anger that had driven him to shove Samuel moments earlier was now replaced with uncertainty. The people watching, including the royal guards, could feel the shift in the air. It was no longer just a confrontation. It was a lesson, one that Samuel was delivering without raising his voice or lifting a finger. The thug took a deep breath, his chest still rising and falling quickly. But this time, it wasn't with rage, it was with confusion. He had always believed that power came from control, from making others feel small. But Samuel's words had made him realize that there was more to strength than he had ever understood. I didn't mean to," the young man stammered, suddenly unsure of himself. Samuel raised a hand, cutting him off gently. "You don't have to explain. Just remember that next time. There's always more to a person than what you see at first. Don't let your first impression be your last." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, the thug didn't know what to say. He had expected the veteran to react in anger, to strike back with force. But instead, he had been shown a different kind of power, one that came from within, from knowing who you were and what you stood for. The crowd, who had been watching intently, slowly began to disperse, some people whispering to each other, impressed by Samuel's response. The royal guards, who had remained still and silent through it all, exchanged glances, their eyes now filled with quiet respect for the veteran, who had shown them all what true strength looked like. For a moment, the young man just stood there, his fists still clenched at his sides. His breath came in shallow bursts, and his gaze darted nervously between Samuel and the crowd that had gathered around them. The anger that had once burned so brightly inside him was now fading, replaced by a deep sense of confusion. He had expected to feel victorious. He had thought that by pushing the older man, he would be able to assert his power, show everyone around him that he was the one in control. But now, In the face of Samuel's calm words, he felt small, like the ground beneath his feet had shifted in ways he couldn't understand. The crowd had fallen silent, watching with bated breath as the young man tried to make sense of what had just happened. The royal guards, though still standing their ground, no longer looked indifferent. Their eyes now held a glimmer of curiosity, as though they were waiting for the next move. For the young man, this moment was unlike anything he had ever faced. He was used to being the one who controlled situations, used to making people back down with his words and actions. But Samuel, with his quiet strength, had turned the tables completely. The thug glanced nervously at the crowd, unsure of how to recover from this. His confidence had been shaken, but he wasn't ready to admit defeat. He had pushed too far, and now he could feel the weight of his mistake pressing down on him. "Well, I didn't think you'd just stand there and talk," the young man muttered, trying to regain some of the bravado he had lost. His voice was softer now, lacking the sharpness it had earlier. "But I get it now, I guess." Samuel didn't say anything right away. He simply nodded, acknowledging the young man's words without reacting. It wasn't the answer the thug had been expecting. He had hoped for more of a confrontation, more of an argument to defend his actions. But Samuel's calm demeanor left no room for that. The young man shifted on his feet, and for the first time, he seemed to consider Samuel's words more deeply. There was a part of him that wanted to walk away, to forget the whole thing and move on. But something inside him told him to stay. There was something here, something important, and he didn't want to miss it. "I'm sorry," the young man said, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. "I didn't mean to. Well, I didn't mean to push you that far." Samuel nodded again, but this time, his expression softened. "It's not about what you meant. It's about what you choose to do after. You can learn from this, or you can let it pass. The choice is yours." The thug stood there, still unsure of how to process everything. He had never been spoken to like this before. No one had ever taken the time to calmly teach him, to offer him a chance to do better. It was a strange feeling, and one that made him feel both embarrassed and thoughtful. For a long moment, there was silence between them. The crowd, sensing that the tension was finally easing, began to disperse. The royal guards, too, seemed to relax slightly, though they still stood watchful. The young man looked up at Samuel one last time, his expression softer than before. "Thanks for not making this worse," he said, his voice almost apologetic. "I don't know why I thought I had to act like that." Samuel offered a small smile, something that was rare for him. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone, especially not to someone like me. The world already expects a lot from us. Sometimes the best thing you can do is just be yourself." With those final words, the young man slowly turned and walked away, his steps slower and more deliberate than before. He didn't look back at Samuel, but he didn't need to. The lesson had been learned, and it would stay with him long after the encounter was over. The crowd began to scatter as well, and the royal guards returned to their positions. But as they stood there, they couldn't help but feel a sense of respect for the quiet veteran, who had shown them all that sometimes the greatest strength came from understanding, not force. As the young man walked away, his steps slower now, the atmosphere around them slowly began to settle. The crowd, which had been holding its breath for so long, began to relax. Murmurs of conversation filled the air once more, but now there was a sense of respect in the crowd's whispers. The royal guards, who had stood at attention throughout the confrontation, remained still as statues. Their eyes followed the young man's retreating figure, and then shifted to the veteran who had handled the situation with calm and control. The royal guards were trained to observe, to remain silent unless needed, but today they had witnessed something different. They had been trained for all kinds of situations: riots, threats, dangerous confrontations, but nothing like this. They were used to responding with force if needed, but they had never been taught how to handle situations with such wisdom, how to teach a lesson with words instead of actions. As Samuel stood there, watching the young man walk away, He felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. He didn't need to raise his fists or shout. He had shown the young man a different kind of power, one that came from understanding and patience. It was a lesson that Samuel knew would stay with him, even if the thug didn't fully understand it now. The royal guards, who had been quietly observing the exchange from the sidelines, exchanged looks. Their training had taught them to respond to violence, but now they were faced with something far more complex. The veteran had managed to handle the situation without ever raising his voice or lifting a hand in anger. To them, it was a display of strength that they hadn't seen before. One of the guards, a young man with a fresh face and eager eyes, spoke first, his voice quiet but full of admiration. "Did you see that?" He didn't even move. He just stood there and spoke, and the thug backed down. His fellow guards nodded in agreement. "It wasn't like any fight I've ever seen." Another guard said, his voice thoughtful. "It wasn't about who could hit hardest or shout loudest. It was about control, about knowing when to act and when to stay still." The senior officer, an older guard with a steady gaze, watched Samuel carefully. "He's not just any man. He's seen things. He knows more than we could ever learn in our training." The younger guards exchanged glances. They had always been taught that physical strength was the key to winning any confrontation. They had been trained to act quickly, decisively, and with force when necessary. But Samuel had shown them a different path, one that didn't rely on strength, but on understanding, wisdom, and the power of words. The senior officer looked back toward Samuel, who had now turned away from the scene, his footsteps calm and steady. There was a quiet dignity in the way the veteran moved, a quiet confidence that the guards couldn't help but respect. The officer knew that Samuel wasn't looking for recognition. He wasn't looking for praise. He had handled the situation with grace because that was simply who he was. "The young man will learn something today," the senior officer said softly, almost to himself. "And it won't be from us. It'll be from him." The younger guards didn't say anything at first. They were still processing what they had just witnessed. Their eyes lingered on Samuel for a moment longer before they turned back to their posts, a new sense of respect in their hearts. As the crowd began to disperse, the royal guards returned to their usual position. But the air felt different now, heavier with understanding, lighter with respect. The veteran's lesson had not only changed the thug, but had also shifted something in the guards themselves. They had learned that sometimes the most powerful response to a threat wasn't a shout or a fist, but the ability to stand still, speak calmly, and hold your ground. The royal guards continued their duty, but their minds were a little more open now. They had seen something today that would stay with them for a long time. They had seen a real display of strength, one that didn't require a sword or a shield, and they would never forget it. As the crowd slowly began to scatter, the marketplace returned to its usual bustle. People went back to their daily routines, but the air seemed to hum with an unspoken understanding. Whispers of what had just happened passed between the townspeople, and many of them carried a new respect for the quiet veteran who had stood his ground without lifting a finger in anger. Samuel walked away from the scene, his steps measured and calm. He had no desire for applause or admiration. For him, this wasn't about proving anything. It was simply about doing what was right. It had always been that way. He had spent many years fighting in wars, dealing with enemies far more dangerous than the young man who had confronted him. But those battles had taught him valuable lessons. They had taught him that true strength wasn't always about force. Sometimes it was about knowing when to walk away, when to hold your ground, and when to teach with words instead of actions. As Samuel made his way home, the thoughts of the encounter lingered in his mind. He had hoped that the young man would take something from this moment. He had hoped that, someday, the thug would look back and realize that power wasn't something you took from others. It was something you earned through respect, through patience, and through understanding. But Samuel knew that not everyone would learn these lessons right away. It would take time. People like the young man often had to live through their mistakes before they could understand their true meaning. Samuel had made plenty of mistakes in his own life, but the lessons he had learned along the way had shaped him into the man he was today. As he reached his modest home, Samuel paused for a moment. He stood in front of the door, looking out over the quiet street. The world outside was full of noise, full of people rushing through their lives without ever stopping to reflect. But for Samuel, this was enough. The peace he had fought for, both in battle and in life, was right here. It was the quiet moments that mattered most to him, the moments when he could rest, think, and appreciate the lessons life had taught him. Inside his home, Samuel set down his things and sat by the window, looking out at the setting sun. He was no longer the soldier he once was, but the experiences of his past had shaped him into someone others could learn from. He knew that he had more to offer than just the stories of battles fought long ago. He had wisdom, patience, and a quiet strength that spoke volumes. It wasn't long before the story of the encounter with the young man spread throughout the city. People who had witnessed it or heard about it began to talk, and Samuel's name was mentioned with a new kind of respect. They didn't talk about his past battles or the things he had done in his youth. They talked about the way he had handled the situation, the calm wisdom with which he had faced the challenge. In a world that often valued strength above all else, Samuel had shown them a different way. The royal guards, too, had begun to speak of the incident among themselves. They respected Samuel's strength, but they also understood the deeper message he had imparted. They had learned something from him that day, a lesson they would carry with them as they continued their duties. Samuel hadn't just defeated a young troublemaker. He had shown them that true power wasn't always about what you could do with your hands. Sometimes it was about what you could do with your heart. And so, Samuel's legacy lived on in the city, not as a story of violence or force, but as a reminder of the quiet strength that comes from understanding, patience, and respect. His actions had left a lasting impression on everyone who had witnessed them. The lessons he had taught would remain long after the day had passed, shaping the hearts and minds of those who had seen the truth in his words. Days passed, but the memory of the encounter remained fresh in the minds of those who had witnessed it. Samuel's quiet strength had made an impression on the people of the city, one that would not fade quickly. The young man who had caused the disturbance had disappeared from the streets, but the lessons Samuel had taught him echoed in the air. People would often stop and talk about the veteran who had refused to fight, yet still commanded respect without raising a fist. As for Samuel, life returned to its usual rhythm. He continued his walks through the city, past the royal guards and the busy market stalls. But now, people seemed to notice him more. They would nod in respect as he passed by, some even offering a quiet word of gratitude. Samuel wasn't sure if the young man had truly understood the lesson, but he knew that at least a few people had seen the wisdom in his actions. One afternoon, as Samuel walked toward the marketplace, he saw a familiar face, a young boy who had been among the crowd when the incident occurred. The boy was no more than 12 or 13, with bright eyes full of curiosity. He approached Samuel slowly, his hands in his pockets, a hesitant look on his face. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said, his voice soft but steady. "I saw what happened the other day. The way you handled that man, without raising your voice or fists. I've never seen anything like it." Samuel stopped and looked down at the boy, a gentle smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I wasn't trying to make a show of it," he replied simply. "Sometimes, the best way to handle things is to stay calm and not let your anger take over." The boy nodded slowly, as if he were taking the words in carefully. "I think I understand. I saw the thug come up to you, and I thought for sure there would be a fight. But you didn't get angry. You just talked to him. I think that's what I want to learn. How to stay calm when things get tough." Samuel's heart warmed at the boy's words. "You're on the right path," he said kindly. "It's not always easy, but the more you practice patience and understanding, the easier it becomes. Strength isn't always about fighting. It's about knowing when to walk away, when to speak, and when to listen." The boy smiled, his face lighting up with a sense of pride. "I'll remember that. Thanks for teaching me." Samuel gave a small nod, watching as the boy hurried off, already deep in thought. As he continued his walk, Samuel couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had made a difference, not just with his actions, but with his words. He had shown the young man, and now this boy, that there was another way to handle conflict, a way that didn't involve anger or violence, but one that came from understanding and patience. As the sun set over the city that evening, Samuel returned to his home. The streets were quieter now, and the shadows grew long, but the peace in his heart was constant. He had learned long ago that there was more to life than fighting, more to strength than physical power. True strength, he had realized, came from within, from the ability to stay calm in the face of adversity, to choose your battles wisely, and to teach others by example. As the day came to a close, Samuel sat by his window, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the night sky. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He had already done his part. The lesson he had taught that day would live on in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. And that was enough for him.